weak certification programs, very weak compliance programs, and I can't even say how many times I've been asked to turn off my cell phone on an airplane as if it mattered during takeoff and landing whether I was looking at a glowing screen. It keeps me up at night worrying that if we have insufficient disclosure, we're going to turn into the cell phone on plane guys.
That was excellent. But I have to be honest with you, panelists, no one actually stuck to just the definition of what you personally thought full disclosure was. You went into, past, present, that's okay, right? The next thing is the process of disclosure, right? And what the fact of the matter is, Blackhat exists today because it is a forum by which we do provide collaborative, collective, somewhat structured data, if you will, to disclose vulnerabilities and exploits. That's why we have Blackhat. That's why DEF CON started, right? Because no one would really pay attention and listen. So my next question is, there's a gazillion different exploits, risks, bugs, fixes that are out there. And on a daily basis. Right now, we probably just went through 15 standing on the stage alone that are being posted somewhere, God knows where, right? How do you filter through that? Which one do you pick first? And is there a trusted entity by which, if you're on the receiving end of a disclosure, let's say you're at Microsoft and someone submits an exploit or a bug or an issue that they found, which one do you go to first? Because I'm sure you get, how many a day would Microsoft get exploits or disclosures posted? Probably 50, 60 from anybody. No?
Emails? Vulnerability reports?
Someone reports to you, XYZ is identified in IE, XYZ is identified in Windows 8. Which one do you pick first?
Well,
who does what?
So this is a direct question for me.
It is.
So thanks. There's a triage process. Obviously, every vendor has to have a triage process. Obviously we have actually a bug bar that we hold to, and it goes through our testing, our repro, and we determine based on the rules of our bug bar what the severity is, criticality, and that affects the triage of how we prioritize vulnerabilities. So every vendor has their own internal processes on how they do this, but it's essentially a triage process.
Okay, so triage process. How do you determine time to respond?
What do you mean? When we receive a vulnerability report from somebody, we acknowledge them, that we received that report.
How do you not,
within 24 hours? So is that?
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so to the other panelists, acknowledging that something is received within 24 hours, a canned response. Thank you for your inquiry. We'll get back to you in a week or two. What would be the mechanism that we should be addressed for responding to a full disclosure entry, right? Because one of our problems that we have here today is all of these are not being addressed in a timely manner. Look at the ATM issue we're dealing with. Who attended that session? Excellent. Last year it was pulled, was it not, from Blackhat? So we had a session last year that was to be presented at Blackhat in regards to exploits and vulnerabilities associated with ATMs. It was pulled by the individual's corporation that he worked for and also their customer, who was an ATM vendor. They said, you can't show this at Blackhat 2009. That was a year ago. You would expect then, a year later, that vulnerability might be addressed, correct? The issue herein lies, we showed it this year, 2010. Instead of one, there were 3 vulnerabilities. No one did anything in a year, even though Blackhat pulled it. No one addressed or fixed anything. Now we have disclosure at Blackhat 2010 with not just 1, but 3 different vulnerabilities associated with an ATM. So the question really is, what happened in a year? Going back to, how do you address it and what's the time to respond? Instead of giving a canned response, we'll get back to you in 6 months. We'll get back to you in 3 months. What would your expectation be?
I mean, frankly, just on an editorial side, I think the irony of Juniper Networks telling, who was it, Barnaby Jack, to pull his presentation is incredibly hypocritical, given that Juniper Networks hired the guy that ISS fired for releasing the Cisco vulnerability.
Yeah, okay.
So I think that Juniper Network, frankly, has no right to tell anybody to shut the hell up. So anyway, with that out of the way, there's an issue. I frankly don't care if ATMs are insecure for the most part, because it doesn't affect me directly. It affects the banks directly. Let the banks go ahead and complain to the ATM vendors that they're not going to use their ATMs if they're not fixed. Where are the bank's responsibilities and the vendors for throwing out this money that are pretty much able to be hacked at random? The problem is like you're looking at things like hacking ATMs. In this case, yes, the vendor had a year to correct these issues. That's issue number one. That should have been addressed, and if right now the vendor is screwing the banks over, and if the banks want to let themselves be screwed over, that's their problem, because right now they're the ones who are on the hook for the money. As far as who else is out there and doing things on the timeline, that's an issue of the vendors are ignoring the process, so go ahead, have at them, get all the money you want. I'm not going to do it because it'd be a crime. But if you're going to do it, it's sort of like, I'll just leave it there. But.
So what's the benefit of full
Actually,
disclosure in that case, right?
Can I reply to that?
Absolutely.
So this is one of these situations where it's so important that we have discussion of what's actually happening. The model that you just discussed said, well, the risk is to the banks, so this is the bank's problem. But actually we have this problem that there are, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of ATMs by Triton with default passwords, and by which it means you walk up to an ATM, you hit a few keys, and the receipt printer just starts printing out people's credit card numbers. Okay, that's not just the bank's problem, because the bank's liability starts at $50. And if you're sitting there with thousands of credit card numbers, you can start taking money out of them, and it becomes everyone's problem. The reality is that security is a new request and a new engineering requirement. Desktop computers were the first things that really got on board with remediating errors. If you start a new engineering requirement in 2001, 2002, you've got this huge legacy issue to deal with. Desktops came first, but man, there's industry after industry that are having to come to terms with what we now consider normal. ATMs are in, but yeah, routers were 2005, and printers never actually got remediated. And even outside of IT, we're seeing stuff with medical devices and so on. It's just a drumbeat over and over and over again. We can't expect everything to run on the schedule that we've evolved to at great expense with desktop computing, but does everything need to get better? Yeah.
I'll respond quickly. I was wrong. Because, again, my threat model was not there where he did, because I didn't realize those were the implications of the drive-by. Because in that case, frankly, I would damn well love to see, I hate class action lawyers. They are really the scum of the earth. But generally, I would love to see a class action lawsuit against both the banks who continue to use it for not forcing the people to do it right, as well as the people who are putting out that equipment. Because if they're keeping the vulnerabilities out there knowingly, and people are buying these things knowingly, and you can't tell me a bank should not have some concept of security, because that's why I said they should have the liability, because they're knowingly allowing these things to be purchased. Well, I don't want people's data to be stolen, but frankly, at this point, the banks are just as responsible as the firm for continuing to use faulty products.
We have a question in the audience.
So, Barnaby Jack last year had anonymously published all this stuff a day later somehow, and had been out there. Does that make a difference?
If Barnaby Jack did that without...
Here.
If he did that without providing the opportunity for the people to fix it, then yeah, I think he should be held liable for allowing the set of crimes to continue.
Would the ATM vendor have done anything about it in the intervening year?
If the ATM vendor did not do anything about it again, you're talking about the hypotheticals, but the hypotheticals are if you create a potential for damage which cannot be otherwise corrected, the case would be if somebody could prove that the vendors actually knew. Because honestly, one of the problems with quote-unquote responsible or full disclosure is that we're talking about, like, for example, I forgot what this specific attack was. There was just a vulnerability announced with Microsoft's products that's been in the product for more, like the actual software where there's a vulnerability was vulnerable for more than a decade, and it was vulnerable, but nobody knew the vulnerability was there. So without knowing that there was a potential to exploit it, we really didn't have a right to complain that Microsoft should have fixed something that wasn't there. Same thing with the ATM vendor. If the ATM vendor did not know that it was there and they were given the opportunity to fix it, that would be great. if they weren't given the opportunity to fix it, unfortunately, the fact is that all those terrible things that would have happened, according to him, would have just as easily come true, but there was no chance for anybody to proactively protect themselves.
Just real quick on that, I'm sorry, Dan. Just real quickly, in looking at the report, because I actually did the research on 2008, 2009, and 2010 Blackhat briefings, vulnerabilities released over the last 3 years. Nicole Tatro and I did it. And one of the things I looked at, and that's why I'm explicitly bringing up the ATM issue, is responsible disclosure. And there was responsible disclosure given in this case 6 months prior to the subject presentation in 2009. Now we're talking 18 months worth of responsible disclosure. So yes, in this case, I can tell you there was responsible disclosure. Dan? Oh, no, go ahead. Do you have another question?
This is more what I was trying to get to.
Should we have the mic taken down to the audience?
Do you want me to do that? Oh, all right. Thank you.
Sure. Is this on?
So there was a private disclosure to the vendor, right? And there was some period of time, and then the talk got called. The vendor's done. I think they've done nothing in 18 months now. Okay.
And there's 2 more.
Okay. So the question being, the private disclosure does not seem to have motivated the vendor in this case. The details being public, does that provide motivation? And that's the question I'd like to
No,
bring up.
frankly, I'll go out. I mean, I will go further and say if what is described is the case, I am fully for somebody shutting their ass down. I mean, and frankly, if they had 6 months of notice and not put it out there, given the potential damage that they would have allowed to theoretically occur, they should be shut down by people. Because if the SEC, well, SEC?
Well, you got to
Or
prove FFIEC.
FFIEC.
So
But I mean,
we're not getting into regs.
yeah,
now,
but
Ira.
anyway.
Okay.
They should shut them down.
Okay. The ultimate customer of a disclosure is not the vendor. The ultimate customer is the user. It's the person whose money's at stake. It's the person whose data at stake. Now, if someone ends up just dropping the information on the public, just on day one, what's the public response? What should it really be? Well, man, someone ought to fix this. And who's the most qualified group to fix a problem in software? The people who actually wrote the software in the first place. So that's why there's value in talking with the vendor, because they're in the best position to do something about it. Now, just because they're in the best position doesn't mean they will or doesn't mean they won't. They might. The goal of responsible disclosure has always been to get the right people on the case. But if they're not on the case, then it has to go to the users and the public that has their data at risk and their funds at risk. You know, in light of realizing what's going on with ATMs, what's going on with default passwords, what's going on with remote vulnerabilities, I got to tell you, I feel like I don't want to stop at a convenience store ATM anymore. I want to go to an actual bank storefront. It's an inconvenience to me, but this is an ability for me to manage my risk. And that's a freedom, and that's a decision that I am being allowed to make only because I have the data. Would I want this data if it hadn't actually had some delay to have there be an opportunity for the problem to be fixed? The best case scenario is every ATM in the world is fixed. If I can't have the best case scenario, well, at least I need to know the data to mitigate what is my money and my data at risk, not theirs.